Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. I'm Genevieve Smith. I'm the Associate Director at the Center for Equity, Gender, and Leadership at the UC Berkeley Haas School of Business. And we are a center that's dedicated to reimagining business for a more equitable and inclusive society. So we do work on campus with students and curriculum development, et cetera. We also do various research and industry partnerships related to equity and inclusion within business. A big core priority area for us is about equitable, inclusive products and services. And in particular, we've been focusing the last several years around artificial intelligence. So what I'll be sharing with you today is a little bit about our research and literature reviews, extensive interviews with experts, as well as our various industry partnerships with tech firms around mitigating bias in AI and advancing inclusive AI. So I'll be talking to you today about, starting off with why are AI systems biased? And I know that a lot of folks in this area already have an understanding, in this room, already have an understanding around bias in AI. But we start with this topic because a lot of times when we're talking to business leaders as well, a lot of times there's a huge focus around technical forms of bias. But from our extensive research and work within industry, bias is not just technical. It's much broader than that. And it's really important for business leaders to have an understanding of the various ways the bias can enter within AI systems because it takes a larger holistic strategy to tackle it. So we have a map that illustrates this that I'll kind of walk through to set the stage for everyone. They'll talk about some of the impacts that we have found related to bias within AI systems, implications for business leaders. Again, these are good different points that we bring up with business leaders to help kind of move the momentum towards thinking about broader strategies and moving more resources towards thinking about mitigating bias and investing more within responsible AI. And then I'll talk about different leadership strategies and concrete plays that leaders can take to mitigate bias and advance inclusion within AI. So to start out with just a little story, in 2019, I applied for a credit card and my husband applied for the same. Despite the same income, debt, and similar credit scores, he received a credit limit that was twice as much as mine. And my story echoes something that also made headline news within 2019, where a husband and wife applied for an Apple Card. Some of you might remember the story that was circulating in the media. And despite having the same income, debt, and credit scores, the husband received a credit limit that was 20 times that of his wife. When they tried to understand why this was happening and talk to the representatives of the credit card company, they could not explain why the algorithm had designated the wife to be so much less creditworthy. So AI systems have massive potential to make decisions more cost-effective, or make decisions more efficient and cost-effective, and reduce human subjectivity. But there's also various ways that bias can enter. So again, AI, we're focusing really on machine learning in particular. So AI using machine learning learns from vast amounts of data points to inform decisions and make predictions, and is a massive business opportunity. This is big business. It's estimated by PwC that AI could add $15.7 trillion to the global economy by 2030. As many of you know, AI is being used to inform who gets interviewed for a job, who is deemed creditworthy to access loans, who is prioritized for life-saving. In the case of COVID-19, AI systems are being used to determine which COVID-19 patients to be prioritized for life-saving support like ventilation. So these are really critical issues that impact our lives every day. So why are AI systems biased? At a high level, AI systems are classification technologies. They are products of the context in which they are created. And we live in a world that has bias, inequality, and discrimination. So is it any surprise that AI systems are reflecting back bias and can result in discrimination? Who is developing AI systems matters. It's their perspectives, their lived experiences, and their knowledge that are integrated into decisions that inform how AI systems are developed. And the who often resembles people in this picture. AI systems are often created in the West and by in large university labs or large tech firms, which tend to be white, technically oriented, affluent, and male. About 18% of leading researchers in the AI space are women, and about 80% of AI professors are men, and you find very large racial and gender disparities within tech firms as well. So beyond that kind of broader perspective, on a more granular level, bias can enter within the data sets and algorithm and how AI systems are used. So a lot of you will be familiar with how bias can enter data sets. Data is rife with economic, gender, and racial disparities. Data is not objective. And a lot of times, also how data is labeled can have opportunities for bias to enter, and different ways data sets are developed as well. A lot of times we hear about over or underrepresentation within a data set that can result in an AI system being more or less accurate for certain populations, and that's one form of bias too. This example, which folks might be familiar with, is a facial recognition algorithm that had a data set which overrepresented both white people and male, and resulted in being more accurate for white men than black women. Then we have biased algorithms as well. So the purpose for which an AI system matters, as well as the proxies and variables that are selected for that AI system to learn from. And how an AI system is evaluated also matters too, and can be a place where bias can enter. A really great example that I like to talk about here is a healthcare algorithm developed by a company called Optum, which was used in hospitals across the US. And this healthcare algorithm was essentially determining that black patients, which were equally sick as white patients, were actually not as sick, resulting in black patients getting less than half the care that equally sick white patients were getting, and resulting, of course, in poor health outcomes for black people. And what was happening is that this AI system was using health spending as a proxy for health needs. But due to racial discrimination longstanding within the healthcare industry and black people spending less on healthcare costs, it was essentially learning to discriminate against, or having a bias against black people. And then lastly, the use of an AI system matters too. AI systems might be used in different contexts for which they were developed. They might be altered, potentially by bad actors, and then how they are interpreted can also depend upon the individual who's using that AI system. Here, an example to share is around ICE. So ICE actually changed an algorithm to create a secret no-release policy for people suspected of breaking immigration law and altering the algorithm. And they were actually sued in 2020 for this. So these different things can result in both inaccurate predictions as well as discriminatory predictions and outputs, which is how we define bias within AI systems. So what happens if AI making important decisions is biased? Well, it can result in a couple of different things, and we've been tracking publicly available instances of bias within AI between 1988 and 2021. And these are the different types of impacts that we have cataloged from our different research in this area. Can result in unfair resource allocation or subpar services, health hazards, safety detriments, infringe on civil liberties, and also have derogatory treatment for individuals. At a broader societal level, this can result in reinforcing existing prejudices, economic inefficiencies and losses, and also compromising on democratic principles. So of the different cataloging of AI systems that exhibit bias that we have found, about 45% exhibit gender bias and about 65% exhibit racial bias. Just as a quick snapshot around the different trends that we've seen, within gender bias in AI systems, the most common types of harms tend to be lower quality of service for women and non-binary individuals, as well as unfair allocation of resources, information, and opportunities, followed by reinforcing harmful stereotypes and prejudices. A lot of biased AI systems experiencing multiple and overlapping forms of these different impacts. So as I mentioned, AI is big business, and tackling bias within AI is incredibly important to engender trust and ultimately advance and scale in the market. So tackling bias in AI can help companies mitigate risk, and bias is something that companies recognize is a material risk to the company. So Microsoft actually put in its Securities and Exchange Commission Form 10Q that bias within its AI systems was a material risk to the firm. So this is something that is recognized as very material. Tackling bias can also help result in a strong brand or a strong brand reputation, ultimately having a better value proposition and staying ahead of legislation. Legislation is continuing to come forward, and so by getting ahead of this, companies can get ahead. And then just being a competitive leader in a fast-paced industry. So there's a lot of reasons that business leaders should want to think about and invest in ultimately creating more robust, ethical, and responsible AI approaches that can help mitigate bias. And we're increasingly seeing companies do this, especially larger scale companies. So what are the actual plays that leaders can take? And again, this is a big part of our research was we know that there's a variety of different research looking at technical forms of bias and technical solutions to bias. So our research really focused on what do business leaders need to know? What are the broader strategies that are required? And so we have 3 different buckets of plays that we've found through our extensive research and our interviews, and again, our different industry partnerships that we've done with tech companies. So first, again, is about the who matters, right? So enabling diverse and multidisciplinary teams, developing and managing AI is the first step. And I will say that for each of these different plays on our website, we have information on all of them, as well as different tools, case studies, and resources that you can access. So it's all open source. I'll share the link with that in a little bit. The second is around promoting a culture of ethics and responsibility within AI. And just to share a little bit about what we mean here, incentive structures matter. And so updating performance review processes to include components around responsible and ethical AI is one step that can be taken. Also, updating OKRs and key performance indicators to integrate considerations around ethics and responsibility and mitigating bias is an opportunity to start to embed incentives within existing structures. We have a resource on our website that can walk through different ways that you can actually work with HR and other leaders to integrate this within your own company structures. And the third is around embedding training on ethics and bias, as well as fairness for employees who are developing and managing these AI systems. We have another resource as well. This is a case study that we've developed and we use on the Berkeley campus with different folks across different departments that looks at an AI system developed for a COVID-19, actually looking at how this AI system is around determining which patients should be allocated to using life-saving technologies. And we walk through what are the different areas that bias can enter, how can you responsibly think about developing such an AI system. So that case study is also available on our website. And then training on language related to diversity, equity, inclusion for employees and contractors labeling data. We did a large partnership with a big technology firm here in the Bay Area around this topic around language, different ways that language can embed bias. And so part of what we did is in this partnership was developed a training program for data annotation and data labelers around building in responsible language within data annotation. And we piloted this with a company that does data annotation for large technology firms, and they're now scaling that lesson plan throughout their global operations. Help them really reflect on different ways and help their data annotators really reflect on different ways that they didn't realize how their own bias can come into play when labeling things like images or even thinking about text as well. So that is something that's also available on our website, open source. And then making explainability and transparency around shortcomings and pitfalls of AI systems the norm. The second bucket of plays is around the AI model itself. So this includes practicing responsible data set development and also establishing policies and practices that enable responsible algorithm development. There's definitely different technical tools that can help with some of these components, as well as non-technical tools. So some of the pieces we talk about within responsible algorithm development are really thinking about the algorithm's purpose and keeping in mind potential fairness trade-offs and ethical considerations when defining the objective of the algorithm. And so within natural language processing, as an example, a lot of times the most human-like communication is the goal of that particular system. But what would happen if your purpose was actually to develop an AI system that communicated in ways that are equitable and inclusive? Thinking about the priority and the purpose up front changes the decisions downstream. So an example of this is a natural language processing tool called Equilid, and this was developed by researchers at Stanford. And one of their purposes for the tool development up front was to develop a tool that was socially equitable. And this changed decisions in terms of how they then developed that tool. A lot of natural language processing data sets use European-centric corpora, and what this means is that tools developed from that will work less well for people that speak different language varieties, like African American English. So this Stanford team really focused around using text such as from African American English, using text from Twitter from different geographies, and also using religious texts. And it was found to perform better and more equitably than other language identification tools. Some other things around here are really documenting the provenance and development of AI systems, including data sources and variables. Some of you might be familiar with model cards, so it's similar to kind of data sheets, but it's essentially a way to, and these are available online as well, not developed by us, but model cards are a way to document what has gone into the particular AI model, and really just being transparent about the types of data and decisions that have informed that AI model. So that is really important as well. And then internal and external audits are something else that we recommend. And then the last bucket of plays is around corporate governance and leadership. So here it's around establishing corporate governance for end-to-end policies to mitigate bias. Again, leadership priorities matter. Those are the priorities that are developed at the top will then permeate throughout the organization and impact the incentives and ways that people think about and contend with ethical issues. So leaders should develop things like ethical AI principles and have ethical AI leads, which I know we'll be talking about in other sessions today, but also just think about the incentive structures that leaders are creating. And this is really tied to that promoting a culture of ethics and responsibility piece as well. And then engaging corporate social responsibility firms or teams to advance responsible and ethical AI and larger systems change. There's a lot of ways that CSR teams can actually help to address data gaps, for example, and other types of issues that are in the responsible AI space. So leveraging those CSR teams, if you have them, is a really great way to think about broader systems change towards more responsible AI. And then lastly, using your voice and influence for industry change and solutions for responsible AI. Legislation, regulation is coming, and there's a really important opportunity for business leaders to get involved in this space. So these are a couple of resources to help you. So my colleague Ishita actually has some physical copies since we're actually at an in-person conference, which is amazing, well, for those of us in person, which is amazing. So if folks are interested and would like a physical copy of the playbook, feel free to come by and get one of those. And our plays with kind of detailed descriptions for each of those 7 strategies with tools and case studies are online on that link as well. And then I've also included here our work that around responsible language in AI and machine learning that talks a bit about the language within data labeling, but also really delves into natural language processing as well and important considerations to keep in mind. So I will end there and look forward to any questions that folks have.